The grand hall of the Frostkeep was built to humble those who stood within it. Soaring pillars of dark, ice-veined stone reached toward a vaulted ceiling lost in Gothic shadows. A bitter winter draught continuously swept across the polished obsidian floor, chilling the blood of anyone who dared to linger. It was a space designed for kings and conquerors, cold and unyielding, carrying the scent of ancient dust and frozen air. Today, it was the site of an execution. Not of a physical life, but of a soul. Valeria Thorne stood pressed against the oppressive weight of the silence. She had just returned from the grueling northern borderlands. Her body was a physical testament to the brutal, unending war she had fought in the name of the Lycan sovereignty. The metallic scent of raw blood, crushed pine needles, and freezing earth clung to her heavy iron armor. Spidery patterns of ice had formed over the thick leather straps of her pauldrons, melting slowly under the ambient heat of the gathered nobility. Silver-threaded scars mapped their way fiercely across her face and cascaded down her shoulder. They were badges of unwavering loyalty to the crown. She was the supreme military defender. She was a battle-tested warrior, and she was supposed to be his. The inner wolf paced frantically behind Valeria's ribs, whining softly in the hollow cage of her chest. The fated mate bond, that sacred thread woven between their souls, pulsed with an agonizing, expectant rhythm. It stretched, it ached, it demanded the warmth of recognition. Her heightened senses tracked every microscopic shift in the room, searching for the safe golden hearth fire she had always found in her king's presence. Every instinct screamed that he would step down, wrap his fur-lined cloak around her battered shoulders, and declare her sacrifices honored. But King Gideon did not look at her with the reverence of a returning mate. He sat upon the high dais, an imposing figure of sovereign power. His stormy gaze, which had once softened only for her in the quiet, isolated shadows of the war tent, were now cold and impenetrable. He wore the heavy mantle of the Alpha King. His broad shoulders were stiff beneath layers of dark fur. His jaw was locked in a rigid line of forced authority. Resting on a crushed velvet cushion on a pedestal beside his throne was the moonstone coronet, the sacred crown of the Luna. For years, the kingdom had whispered that the ancient silver band was destined for Valeria's scarred brow. For years, she had bled into the snow, taking lethal strikes meant for the monarch to earn the right to stand beside him in the light. Instead, Gideon's large, battle-hardened hand rested on the delicate, unblemished wrist of another woman. Cynthia Sterling stood beside the king, radiant in the way a fragile winter frost was radiant. She possessed a porcelain, untouched beauty that the elite inner court fiercely adored. Her skin was flawless. Her gown was a sweeping, extravagant cascade of silver and pale grey silk that pooled around her feet like liquid moonlight. The scent of poisoned honey and overripe lilies rolled off her, cloying and overwhelmingly sweet, masking the complete absence of a warrior's grit. She was the perfect, pristine noblewoman. She had never held a blade. She had never watched a comrade die in the freezing mud, nor had she ever felt the terrifying chill of a rogue beast's breath against her neck. She had simply existed, beautiful and whole, waiting in the safety of the inner keep to collect the spoils of Valeria's war. The crown requires perfection. Gideon's voice boomed. The sound shattered the tense, frozen quiet of the Frostkeep hall. It was heavy, absolute, and devoid of the instinctual warmth Valeria's wolf desperately craved. It took exactly 6 words to shatter her world. The kingdom requires an unblemished queen. Valeria did not flinch. She kept her spine straight, her chin lifted high, even as the first horrific spike of physiological pain pierced her chest. She forced her lungs to expand, drawing in the freezing draft to steady her racing heart. Gideon stood up. His towering frame cast a long, dark shadow over the polished marble steps of the dais. He finally met Valeria's gaze, but his expression remained a mask of cold, political calculation, desperately attempting to hide a microscopic tremor of guilt in his lower lip. "You have served Valdron well, Valeria," he said. His voice dropped slightly. The formal words clearly tasted like ash on his tongue. "Your sacrifices on the front lines will be recorded in the royal archives. But look at yourself. He gestured openly toward her, toward the jagged, silver-lined tissue that severely marred her left cheek, toward the deep, fresh gouge across her shoulder plate that had barely stopped bleeding beneath the battered iron. Every scar was a map of a battle won for his name, yet he pointed to them as if they were a disease. "You are a weapon," the king continued, the formal, detached tone acting as a brutal physical blow to her sternum, a battle-scarred weapon forged for the dirt and the blood. "The throne cannot be occupied by a woman who frightens the court. My Luna must be a symbol of beauty, of peace, not a walking reminder of the slaughter." A collective, breathy murmur ran through the gathered nobility. They stared at the scarred warrior with a sickening mixture of pity and revulsion. Their pristine, soft hands covered their mouths to block out the scent of her exhaustion. They had slept soundly in their warm beds because of her blade, yet now they recoiled from the very blood that had bought their safety. Valeria's inner beast let out a gut-wrenching howl of betrayal. It thrashed violently against the confines of her mind. The mating mark on the back of her neck, a phantom, instinctual brand that had tied her to Gideon since the moment their eyes first met 3 years ago, suddenly ignited. It did not warm like a hearth fire. It burned like cold iron pressed directly to raw nerve endings. The physical agony of the severed bond radiated down her spine. It froze the blood in her veins. It turned her extremities numb. She was being discarded, not for a lack of strength, not for a lack of profound loyalty, but because she bore the very physical wounds she had willingly taken to keep him alive. Cynthia offered a polite, frozen smile. Her delicate fingers tightened possessively around the dark fur of Gideon's forearm. "We thank you for your service, Valeria," she murmured. Her voice was a soft, melodic chime that grated against Valeria's heightened, ringing senses. "Your scars are a tragic necessity for the realm's safety, but the king deserves a wife who can be presented to the allied territories without causing immediate alarm." Valeria stared at the untouched woman. She acutely noted the absence of calluses on Cynthia's hands. She heard the shallow, rapid breathing of a fragile creature that had never known true terror. Then she shifted her gaze back to the Alpha King. She did not weep. She did not plead. She did not fall to her bruised knees and beg him to remember the secluded nights he had held her scarred body in the dark, swearing that she was the only one his soul recognized. Silence was her shield. It was the only armor she had left. Gideon's jaw clenched tighter. He looked away, unable to hold her steady, unwavering stare for more than a few seconds. His broad chest rose and fell in a sharp, shallow rhythm, his knuckles turning stark white where they gripped the armrest of his throne. He was trying to convince himself that this was a necessary political maneuver, that he was choosing the stability of his kingdom over the wild, violent, instinctual pull of his true fated mate. Yet, to Valeria's hyper-aware senses, his biological distress was undeniable. Gideon's natural scent, a grounding, instinctual rush of winter pine and sharp wood smoke, was being suffocated. It fought a losing biological battle against the cloying, heavy miasma of poisoned honey and overripe lilies rolling off Cynthia. It felt as though the king was being buried alive under a mountain of rotting petals, his true alpha essence drowning in superficial sweetness, suppressed by the very aesthetic perfection he claimed to desire. "I reject this bond," Gideon declared. His voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling, formalizing the deepest psychological and biological betrayal a lichen could inflict. "I, King Gideon of Valdron, permanently sever the fated tie to Valeria Thorne. I choose Cynthia Sterling as my Luna, my mate, and my queen." The words were a physical blade twisting violently into Valeria's gut. The sacred thread woven between their souls snapped. The biological recoil was violent. A concussive wave of sensory deprivation left her tasting copper and bitter ash. Her wolf whimpered, curling into a tight, dark ball of agony, retreating into the deepest, coldest recesses of her consciousness. The burning on her neck intensified until it felt as though the skin was blistering under the sheer weight of the rejection. The air in her lungs turned to ice, yet she stood unmoving, beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, unbending, She simply watched as Gideon reached out for the moonstone coronet. His large hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he lifted the glowing ancient silver band from its velvet cushion. He turned to Cynthia, who lowered her perfect, unblemished head with practiced, demure grace. The sacred crown settled flawlessly into her pale hair, reflecting the cold light of the keep. The court erupted into polite, hollow applause. Valeria stood in the center of the cheering room, alone. The freezing wind from the heavy oak doors bit into her fresh wounds, but she barely registered the temperature drop. The physical pain of her injuries paled in comparison to the vast, hollow void that had just violently opened in the center of her chest. She was a scarred, bleeding warrior in a room full of untouched porcelain, and she had just learned the hardest lesson of the sovereign court. Her loyalty meant nothing. The polite applause slowly faded into a hushed, expectant murmur as Elder Orlan stepped out from the deep shadows of the dais. The high priest of the Lycan sovereignty moved with a slow, deliberate, heavy cadence. His thick ceremonial robes brushed loudly against the frosted stone. He carried a hanging silver censer. The thick, aromatic smoke of burning sage and crushed myrrh spilled over the rim, heavily perfuming the icy air and attempting to mask the pungent, sour scent of severed bonds. Orlan's weathered, heavily lined face was etched with deep furrows of sorrow. His cloudy eyes remained fixed firmly on the floor, rather than looking at the scarred warrior. He was a strict, unwavering follower of ancient law, strictly bound to officiate the royal decrees, but privately, the elder was deeply dismayed by the king's blind, superficial arrogance. Orlan raised his gnarled, trembling hands. His voice was a raspy, echoing chant that invoked the spirits of the ancestors and the mandate of the moon goddess. We gather in the sacred light of the Frost Keep to witness the binding of the crown. The priest intoned, the ancient words sounding incredibly hollow and mechanical in the freezing hall. To bless the formal union of King Gideon and his chosen Luna, Cynthia Sterling, may their reign be absolute, may their royal bloodline remain pure. As the old priest reached into a silver bowl, preparing to smear the ceremonial marking ash across Cynthia's pristine forehead, Gideon raised a massive hand. He abruptly stopped the ritual. The king's piercing gaze darted back to Valeria, who had not moved a single inch from her position in the center of the hall. Her stillness was deeply unnerving. It was the terrifying, calculating calm of an apex predator quietly assessing a fatal strike. Gideon desperately needed her to break. He needed her to bow, to weep, to validate his terrible, cowardly choice by showing some form of public weakness. Her stoic dignity was a flawless mirror reflecting his own profound cowardice, and the Alpha King could not stand to look at it. Before the blessing is complete, Gideon announced. His voice strained heavily to maintain its authoritative timbre against the silent pressure of the room. There is a matter of state security and sacred tradition. The Supreme Military Defender serves the Luna. To finalize this transition of power, Valeria Thorn will present her family's war relic to her new queen as a formal token of submission. A suffocating, heavy silence immediately descended upon the grand hall. Even Elder Orlan froze mid-motion. His hands trembled so violently that a tiny speck of hot ash tumbled from the swinging censer, hissing as it struck the obsidian floor. Valeria's calm gaze shifted down to the heavy iron weapon strapped securely to her hip, the ember blade. It was not a decorative ceremonial trinket meant for display. It was a massive, brutally scarred broadsword, forged in the ancient, unforgiving fires of the high country, carried into battle by 3 generations of Thorn warriors. The hilt was tightly wrapped in worn, blood-stained leather. The dark, dense metal of the blade was chipped and deeply notched from cleaving through the bones of the kingdom's greatest enemies. It was incredibly heavy with history and sacrifice. It was a weapon that required immense physical strength and an unyielding, hardened will to wield. Cynthia's delicate, flawless features twisted into a momentary, ugly grimace of disgust as she looked down at the battered, bloody weapon, but her ingrained vanity quickly masked the reaction. She wanted the blade not to use it, but to mount it on a wall as a conquered, subjugated trophy. a visual symbol to the entire court that she, the unblemished beauty, had tamed the scarred, lethal beast of the borderlands. "Hand the sword to your queen, Valeria," Gideon commanded. His tone dropped dangerously into the low, rumbling, instinctual register of an alpha attempting to force submission through sheer biological vocal dominance. The inner wolf inside Valeria went dead still. The agonizing, blistering burn of the severed mating mark on her neck suddenly faded beneath a rushing, overwhelming wave of ice-cold clarity. She had bled into the dirt for this man. She had willingly taken the filthy claws of rogue beasts to her own face so that his would remain perfectly unmarred for the court. And now he wanted her to surrender her ancestors' hard-earned honor to a woman who would flinch and scream at the mere sight of a paper cut. Valeria stepped forward. The heavy, rhythmic, metallic thud of her armored boots echoed like a solitary war drum against the vaulted ceiling. The assembled elite nobles practically climbed over each other to scramble out of her direct path, genuinely afraid of the scarred warrior moving toward the throne with dead eyes. She did not stop her deliberate march until she was standing at the very base of the dais, looking up at the man who had just systematically destroyed her life. Gideon's breath hitched audibly. Close up, he could finally smell her properly. The wild, intoxicating, instinctual scent of pine, winter air, and wood smoke heavily laced with the metallic tang of fresh battlefield blood. For a fraction of a second, his pupils blew wide. His own dominant beast frantically clawed at the inside of his chest, screaming at him to step down, to grab her, to drag her away from the judging, superficial eyes of the court, and beg for her unconditional forgiveness. His knuckles turned bone white. His rigid, upright posture was a desperate, failing attempt to physically hold back a monstrous, kingdom-ending mistake. But Valeria did not look at him with longing. She looked at him with the cold, clinical, detached assessment of a veteran soldier identifying a lost cause. Slowly, deliberately, she reached down and unclasped the heavy leather retention harness. She wrapped her calloused, labor-worn fingers around the familiar hilt of the ember blade and drew it smoothly from its scabbard. The harsh, aggressive scrape of cold steel against leather shrieked violently through the silent hall. Cynthia instinctively shrank back. Her porcelain hands flew up defensively to protect her perfect face. A pathetic, high-pitched whimper escaped her throat as she frantically hid behind the king's broad shoulder. Valeria did not offer the hilt forward. She held the massive, ancient weapon horizontally in both of her hands, feeling the familiar, grounding, heavy weight of the cold iron. She felt the deep pulse of her own latent magic, a deep, ancient silver energy that had lain dormant beneath her warrior's exterior, flare to sudden, aggressive life in her veins. She lifted her heavily armored knee. With a swift, brutal, explosive exhalation of breath, she brought the flat center of the ancient blade crashing down against the solid steel plate of her kneecap, actively channeling every single ounce of her shattered bond, every drop of her physical agony into the kinetic strike. The deafening crack of shattering iron exploded through the Frostkeep. Sparks rained down violently against the dark obsidian tiles. The legendary Ember Blade, a weapon that had survived centuries of brutal warfare without a single fracture, snapped cleanly in two. The sheer, terrifying physical force required to break enchanted iron bare-handed was biologically impossible. Yet Valeria stood there, breathing evenly, effortlessly holding the two jagged, ruined halves of her family's legacy. Elder Orlan dropped the censer in sheer shock. It clattered loudly down the marble steps, spilling burning, red-hot embers in a chaotic trail. Gideon shot to his feet, his steel-colored eyes blew wide with primal shock. Valeria! She did not let him finish his sentence. She stepped one pace forward and tossed the heavy, broken pieces of dark metal onto the stone directly at the king's feet. The jagged iron clanged loudly, the dissonant sound echoing like a final death knell for his reign. "I accept your rejection, King Gideon," Valeria stated. Her voice was not a scream. It was not a plea. It was a low, steady command that carried the chilling, unforgiving weight of a mountain blizzard. "And I relinquish my rank." The crown may have your pristine queen, but neither of you will ever hold my sword." She did not wait for a formal dismissal. She did not offer a subservient bow. Valeria Thorne turned her back on the throne, her spine straight, her shoulders relaxed, and began the long, silent walk toward the heavy oak doors. The nobles parted in terrified silence. They were too stunned to whisper, too afraid to even draw breath. Valeria pushed through the massive entrance, stepping out into the biting fury of the winter storm. The cold air rushed against her unbandaged cheek, but it could not freeze the fierce silver resolve igniting in her veins. Over the next 3 days, she would formally dismantle her command. She would strip her insignias, pack the remaining shards of her armor, and leave her military post in the Frostkeep entirely. She would retreat to the freezing, isolated borderlands of Thornwick to heal her broken mate bond in silence. But in this singular moment, she simply walked into the snow, refusing to look back. Gideon stood frozen on the dais, staring down at the broken iron at his feet. His broad chest he heaved frantically as the catastrophic, heavy weight of what he had just done finally began to set in. He had chosen superficial beauty over the scarred warrior who loved him, and as the heavy doors of the grand hall slammed shut behind her, vanishing her from his sight, the Alpha King realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that he had just voluntarily severed the only thing that had ever kept his kingdom safe. The winter storm that ravaged the outer edges of the Lycan sovereignty was not merely a shift in weather. It was a brutal physical force, a grinding wall of ice and howling wind that sought to strip the warmth from anything foolish enough to wander beyond the capital's protected borders. For 3 days, Valeria Thorne walked into the teeth of it. She had formally dismantled her command in complete silence, leaving her insignias of rank meticulously folded on her empty cot in the barracks. She took no provisions from the royal stores. She accepted no escort. She simply walked out of the Frostkeep and pointed her heavy leather boots toward the freezing, isolated borderlands of Thornwick, dragging the shattered, bleeding remains of her soul behind her. Every step was a monumental exertion of biological will. The heavy iron armor that had once felt like a second skin now weighed upon her shoulders like a mountain of lead. The ambient temperature had plummeted far below freezing, dropping into a lethal, flesh-killing absolute zero. Yet the back of her neck radiated a sickening, blistering heat. The severed fated mate bond was not a clean surgical cut. It was a necrotic, phantom brand that continuously burned through her nervous system, misfiring agonizing signals to a wolf that refused to respond. Her inner beast lay completely dormant, curled into a tight, dark ball of silent trauma in the deepest recesses of her mind. It did not whimper, it did not pace, it did not claw at the walls of her consciousness. It simply endured the suffocating void where the king's golden hearth fire used to burn. The air in her lungs crystallized with every shallow, rattling breath. The jagged, silver-threaded scars across her face ached fiercely as the frost settled into the damaged, uneven tissue. She pushed through snowdrifts that reached her thighs, her vision narrowing to a tunnel of blinding white and violent grey. The Thornwick borderlands were unforgiving. It was a jagged expanse of black rock, frozen lakes, and ancient pine, a place where only the most hardened outcasts and battle-tested veterans survived. It was exactly where she belonged, a forgotten weapon returning to the wild dirt. She did not allow herself to think of the Frostkeep. She did not allow herself to picture the moonstone coronet resting on porcelain skin. She focused entirely on the mechanical, rhythmic motion of placing one frozen foot in front of the other. By the twilight of the 3rd day, the physiological toll of the public rejection finally eclipsed her supernatural endurance. Valeria did not stumble dramatically. She did not cry out to the empty, howling sky. Her body simply reached the absolute limit of its cellular capacity and initiated a violent shutdown. Her right knee buckled. The solid steel plate of her greave struck the hidden, frozen earth beneath the snow with a dull, heavy thud. She attempted to plant her heavily coal-used hands in the drifts to force herself back upright, but her freezing muscles refused the command. The agonizing, Relentless fire of the broken bond surged violently up her spine, effectively paralyzing her extremities. She collapsed forward. The icy, blinding powder embraced her scarred cheek like a cold shroud. The silence of the snow was absolute. It was a quiet, heavy blanket that slowly began to muffle the roaring in her ears. The metallic tang of her own raw blood, seeping sluggishly from the reopened wounds beneath her armor, mixed with the sharp aroma of crushed pine needles and frozen earth. She stared straight ahead at the darkening tree line, her vision blurred, her pulse slowed to a lethargic, heavy crawl. The freezing temperature was supposed to break her. Instead, it felt like a mercy, offering a numb, quiet sanctuary away from the suffocating politics of a court that despised her. She closed her eyes, entirely willing to let the winter claim what the Alpha King had discarded. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of boots breaking through the icy crust broke the stillness. Valeria could not turn her head, but her fading senses registered the sudden disruption in the freezing air currents. The scent hit her a fraction of a second before the shadow fell over her prone form. It was a stark, practical aroma of dried yarrow, crushed wintergreen, and sharp medicinal herbs, entirely devoid of the superficial perfumes that choked the capital. I told you the elevation in these mountains would eventually freeze the blood in those veins, Commander. The voice was rough, calm, and perfectly steady. Cailan Drake stepped into her fading line of sight. The devoted mountain medic wore a heavy, worn leather coat lined with thick wolf pelt, his dark hair plastered against his forehead by the driving sleet. He did not look at her with kissing pity of the elite nobles. He looked at her with the clinical, unyielding assessment of a veteran field medic who had dragged her out of a dozen different slaughterhouses. He knew instantly that this was not a simple case of frostbite. The erratic, shallow hitch of her chest and the unnatural, sickly pallor beneath her battle scars told him everything he needed to know about the catastrophic biological trauma she had just endured at the Frostkeep. Cailan dropped to one knee beside her in the snow. He did not waste time with frantic questions. His hands moved with practiced, efficient speed, unbuckling the heavy leather straps of her frozen pauldrons and tossing the useless freezing iron aside. "You always were too stubborn to die in a warm bed," Cailan muttered, his jaw tight as he assessed the terrifying heat radiating from the broken mating mark on her neck. He slid his arms beneath her unarmored shoulders and the backs of her knees, lifting her with a grunt of exertion. Valeria's head lolled against his chest. She lacked the strength to protest as the healer carried her away from the snowbank, navigating the treacherous, icy incline with the sure-footed grace of a wolf born to the high mountains. The transition from the freezing void of the wilderness to the interior of Cailan's remote sanctuary was a sudden, violent, sensory shock. The heavy wooden door of his cabin slammed shut against the blizzard, instantly cutting off the deafening howl of the wind. The air inside was thick and incredibly warm. A massive stone hearth roared with a towering golden fire, casting long dancing shadows across walls lined with hundreds of hanging glass vials and drying roots. The scent of boiling water, sharp medicinal herbs, and dry cedarwood filled her lungs, forcibly dragging her fading consciousness back from the brink. Cailan laid her gently on a sturdy cot near the fire. He immediately began stripping away the remaining ice-locked layers of her tunic, ignoring the horrific tapestry of old battle wounds that littered her torso. His expression remained utterly focused. He turned to his workbench, retrieving a small, dark glass jar that radiated a faint, acrid smell. Valeria stared up at the wooden rafters, her slate-hued gaze vacant and unfocused. She did not flinch when Cailan applied the silver salve directly to the inflamed, blistering skin of her neck where the bond had been severed. The burning herbal ointment seared her nerve endings, a sharp, localized chemical fire that actively fought back against the necrotic spread of the psychological wound. The skin-tearing agony of the severed fated mate bond was immense, but the salve anchored her to the physical world, demanding that her body remember how to survive. "Drink," Cailan ordered softly. He lifted her head, pressing the rim of a warm clay mug to her cracked lips. She swallowed the bitter, earthy liquid mechanically. The hot broth coated her freezing throat, sending a slow creeping wave of functional warmth into her core. She was safe. She was hidden. The remote sanctuary was a world away from the judging, untouched porcelain faces of the sovereign court. As the intense physical exhaustion finally dragged her into a deep, dreamless unconsciousness, Valeria Thorne allowed her straight spine to relax into the rough wool blankets, entirely unaware of the chaos she had left behind in the capital. While the scarred warrior found quiet survival in the brutal north, the inner sanctum of the Frostkeep reeked of expensive panic. The catacombs beneath the royal palace were ancient. They were carved directly from the bedrock of the mountain, a sprawling network of low-ceilinged chambers lit only by the flickering, unsteady light of heavy iron torches. The air down here was stagnant and oppressive. It tasted distinctly of old dust, damp earth, and the metallic residue of centuries of lichen blood magic. This was the sacred heart of the territory. It was not a place for superficial beauty. It was a place for primal, biological anchors. Elder Orlan stood before the central dais, his thick ceremonial robes brushing heavily against the rough-hewn stone. His weathered face was grim, entirely devoid of the celebratory joy that should have accompanied a new royal binding. Resting in the center of the obsidian slab was the ceremonial chalice. It was a massive, brutal vessel forged of dark iron and lined with oxidized copper. The rim was jagged, designed to command respect. Inside the heavy metal bowl rested a thick, dark mixture of sacred ceremonial earth and freshly drawn beast blood, the primal elements required to physically tie the new Luna to the territory's defensive wards. King Gideon stood perfectly rigid in the shadows near the entrance, his broad arms crossed tightly over his chest. He wore his crown, but the iron band felt like a suffocating vice around his skull. His intense stare was locked onto the woman standing at the edge of the dais. Cynthia Sterling was trembling violently. The pristine noblewoman had descended into the catacombs wrapped in a heavy, immaculate white fur cloak, clutching the fabric tightly around her throat as if the very air of the sanctum might infect her. The moonstone coronet sat securely on her perfectly styled pale hair, but beneath the ancient silver, her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The ritual of protection requires a physical sacrifice of pride, my queen, Elder Orlan intoned, his raspy voice echoing harshly off the low ceiling. He gestured toward the ceremonial chalice with a gnarled, trembling hand. You must submerge your hands into the sacred earth. You must trace the sigil of the sovereign upon the stone, mixing the blood of the ancestors with your own scent. Only then will the kingdom's wards recognize you as their absolute mother. Cynthia took a frantic, staggering step backward. Her silver-heeled shoes slipped slightly on the damp stone. She stared at the thick, coagulating mixture inside the heavy bowl as if it were a pit of venomous serpents. No, Cynthia whispered. Her voice, usually a soft, melodic chime, was strained and high-pitched with genuine panic. I am not touching that. It's filthy. It reeks of rot and wet dogs. The words echoed in the suffocating silence of the chamber. Elder Orlan slowly closed his eyes, a deep, weary sigh escaping his lined face. He had overseen the bindings of 4 generations of Lycan rulers. Never once had a Luna refused the fundamental dirty reality of the earth that sustained them. It is the blood of the warriors who died to build these walls, the old priest corrected, his tone dropping into a dangerous, reprimanding gravel. It is the sacred soil of Valdron. If you do not touch it, the ritual fails. The border wards will not hold. The territory will remain blind. I am the queen! Cynthia shrieked, her porcelain composure completely shattering under the pressure of the damp, terrifying catacombs. She spun around to face the shadows where the Alpha King stood. Gideon, tell him, I am not ruining my skin with that disgusting mire. I am meant to sit on the throne to receive the allied lords, not to play in the mud like a feral border hound. Gideon did not move. He did not rush forward to comfort her. He did not wrap his large protective hands around her trembling, unblemished shoulders. Instead, the king's inner beast violently slammed against the cage of his ribs, roaring in absolute instinctual revulsion. The cloying, overwhelming scent of poisoned honey and overripe lilies that rolled off Cynthia in waves of panic suddenly made Gideon physically nauseous. He actively stopped breathing through his nose, his jaw clenching so hard that the muscles in his neck jumped. He stared at the untouched, flawless woman he had chosen to elevate over his fated mate. He watched her cower from a simple bowl of ceremonial earth, and in that suffocating, subterranean silence, a vivid, agonizing memory flashed behind the king's eyes. He remembered Valeria Thorne. He remembered her standing knee-deep in the freezing, blood-soaked mud of the northern trenches. He remembered the way she had wiped the gore of a massive rogue beast from her scarred cheek with the back of her armored gauntlet, her storm-grey eyes burning with fierce, unyielding protective fury. She had never once flinched from the dirt. She had never once complained about the blood. She had bathed in the horrific violence of the realm, solely to ensure that the people of the capital could sleep in pristine safety. Gideon's large hands slowly curled into tight, trembling fists at his sides. The leather of his gloves creaked under the immense physical pressure. The catastrophic, kingdom-ending weight of his arrogance finally crashed down upon his shoulders, threatening to crush his spine. He had banished the supreme military defender because her scars offended the visual aesthetic of his court. He had severed a sacred, biological bond for a woman who was too terrified to even touch the soil of the land she claimed to rule. "Gideon, please," Cynthia begged, tears of pure frustration and fear welling in her delicate eyes. She pointed a shaking, perfectly manicured finger at the ceremonial chalice. "Make him skip this part. Just give me the blessing. I cannot do it." The Alpha King finally stepped out of the shadows, his towering frame completely dominant the small, flickering light of the torches. He walked slowly toward the dais, his boots heavy and devoid of their usual confident rhythm. He stopped beside the trembling noblewoman, looking down at the ancient, blood-stained metal of the ritual bowl. "You cannot protect them," Gideon stated. The words were not a question. They were a hollow, devastating realization. His voice was completely flat, drained of all sovereign authority. Cynthia blinked, her tears pausing as she looked up at his rigid profile. "I am a symbol of peace, Gideon. We agreed. The court needs beauty, not savagery." "The court needs a shield," Gideon corrected softly, his chest physically aching from the vast, hollow void where Valeria's instinctual warmth used to reside. The phantom pain of the severed bond flared in his chest, a sharp, twisting agony that made him want to drop to his knees on the damp stone. "And I just broke the only one we had." Elder Orlan did not offer a word of comfort. The high priest simply reached out and pulled a heavy velvet cloth over the ceremonial chalice, obscuring the ceremonial blood from view. The ritual was dead. The territorial wards of Valdron would remain completely unanchored, leaving the kingdom biologically and magically exposed to whatever horrors lurked beyond the tree line. Gideon turned his back on the crying, pristine queen. He walked toward the heavy iron doors of the catacombs, his mind frantically calculating the vast, terrifying distance between the capital and the freezing borderlands of Thornwick. Cynthia didn't know that the man walking away from her was already drowning in a terrifying ocean of his regret. She didn't know that the crown resting on her head was entirely worthless without the magic of the sanctum. All she knew was that her silk dress remained perfectly clean. The Alpha King emerged from the darkness of the lower levels, the heavy realization settling into his bones like a terminal sickness. He had chosen superficial perfection over the scarred warrior who had loved him. Now, as the first howl of a distant, encroaching threat echoed through the mountain passes, King Gideon understood that his flawless kingdom was about to bleed. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a deep, smouldering golden ember by the time Valeria Thorne finally opened her eyes. The heavy wooden rafters of Caelan Drake's cabin were shrouded in a thick, fragrant haze of dried sage, wild thyme, and boiling medicinal roots. Outside the sturdy log walls, the relentless Thornwick blizzard battered the timber, a howling, chaotic force of nature that sought to crush the tiny mountain sanctuary beneath drifting mountains of snow. Yet, inside the single-room dwelling, the ambient temperature was almost suffocatingly warm, heavy with the earthy scent of drying leaves and wood smoke. Valeria lay perfectly still on the narrow, rope-strung cot. She did not immediately try to sit up or shift her heavy limbs. She was a battle-tested veteran soldier who had spent a decade surviving brutal winter campaigns across the northern borderlands. Her very first instinct upon waking from deep unconsciousness was to conduct a silent, highly methodical clinical assessment of her own biological state. The agonizing, blistering fire at the base of her skull, where the claiming mark had been forcibly severed, had dulled to a deep, radiating throb. The broken, fated mate bond still felt like a massive, hollow void in the center of her chest, a physical numbness where her wolf had once breathed in tandem with a king, but the immediate, flesh-killing necrosis had been halted by the healer's intervention. However, the jagged, silver-threaded scars, cutting across her cheek and stretching down over her left collarbone and shoulder, burned with a strange, localized intensity. It was not the familiar, stinging pain of torn muscle tissue or cracked iron armor slicing into skin. It felt like a dormant, heavy pressure pushing outward from her very bloodstream, a primal kinetic energy demanding immediate release. Cailan Drake stood at his sturdy wooden workbench across the dimly lit room, his broad back turned completely toward her cot. The resolute physician was methodically grinding something inside a heavy stone mortar. The harsh, rhythmic scrape of the granite pestle against stone echoed cleanly through the quiet cabin, providing a steady, grounding counterpoint to the screaming wind outside the frosted window panes. The stark, practical aroma of crushed wintergreen, raw moonbloom, and iron-rich mountain soil filled the dense air. He was preparing a fresh, highly concentrated batch of the silver salve, the rare herbal formulation he had used to treat torn flesh and shattered bone beside her on the blood-stained war fronts. "Your pulse leveled out 3 hours ago," Cailan stated, his hands never pausing in their rhythmic, circular grinding. He did not need to turn around to know she was awake and observing him. His medical senses were perfectly attuned to the microscopic shifts in her breathing rhythm and the subtle rise of her body temperature. But the localized tissue damage on your face and shoulder is reacting violently to the atmospheric temperature drop. The old wounds are attempting to reopen from the inside out. Valeria slowly pushed herself up into a rigid sitting position. The rough wool blankets pooled around her waist, revealing that she wore only a thin, coarse linen tunic, her battered iron armor long since stripped away and discarded by the door. Her metallic irises remained completely vacant, staring unflinchingly at the flickering golden embers in the stone fireplace. She did not offer a single complaint about the burning pressure in her flesh. Silence was her absolute shield. It was the only armor she had left after being stripped of her title before the entire sovereign court. "Then bind them," she rasped. Her voice was incredibly dry, sounding like cracked winter ice grinding against river stones. "I need to be able to wield a weapon by tomorrow." Cailan finally turned around, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He carried a small dark glass jar in his collused hands. Inside the vessel, the new mixture of the silver salve was thick, iridescent, and practically vibrating with a latent, volatile chemical energy. He approached the narrow cot, his rugged face set into a mask of clinical, unyielding assessment. He knew her character too well to offer useless pity. He knew she was not planning to return to the polished halls of the capital to beg for her place. He knew she intended to walk deeper into the lethal borderlands, to vanish entirely into the wild, frozen dirt where the Alpha King could never track her scent. "I am not going to bind them," Cailan replied softly, pulling up a low wooden stool to sit directly beside the edge of the cot. "I am going to burn the necrosis out to the root. This is a pure extraction of the high country alpine botanicals. It will not be gentle, Commander." Valeria didn't know that the man sitting beside her had spent his entire life studying the forbidden, ancient bloodlines of the realm in secret. She didn't know that the specific, volatile combination of herbs inside his glass jar was not meant for treating simple physical flesh wounds, and she definitely didn't know that the dormant, suppressed magic sleeping inside her scarred body was about to respond violently to the chemical catalyst. All she knew was the immediate, terrifying physical ache of her absolute isolation. She lifted her chin, presenting the ruined left side of her face to the healer without hesitation. She did not flinch or pull away. "Do it." Kalen dipped 2 rough fingers into the iridescent ointment, gathering a heavy bead of the glowing balm. He reached out and pressed the potent mixture directly against the deepest, most jagged groove of tissue cutting across her cheekbone. The biological reaction was instantaneous and violent. A concussive wave of sheer, blinding cold shot through Valeria's entire nervous system. It was not the freezing bite of the winter wind rattling the window frames. It was the ancient, terrifying chill of a glacial depth, an elemental frost that seemed to freeze her blood in her veins. Her jaw locked with a harsh snap. Her fists clenched so tightly in the heavy wool blankets that her knuckles turned stark white, the joints popping audibly in the quiet cabin. She forced her lungs to expand, drawing in the thick herb-scented air through her clenched teeth, absolutely refusing to let out a single vocal sound of agony. Kalen moved methodically, applying the heavy ointment down the curve of her throat and across the deep raised gouge on her shoulder. The burning herbal mixture seared her exposed nerve endings, acting as a sharp, localized chemical fire that actively stripped away the dead, damaged layers of her skin to expose the raw tissue beneath. But then the nature of the pain abruptly shifted. The suffocating glacial cold was completely overwhelmed and replaced by a sudden, rushing wave of immense, radiating heat. It did not come from the ambient warmth of the hearth fire. It erupted from deep inside her own marrow. Valeria gasped, her spine snapping perfectly straight as her ribcage expanded. Beneath Kalen's careful fingers, the scarred tissue began to physically transform. The thick, jagged lines of ruined flesh did not fade away into nothingness. They did not smooth out to resemble the untouched, porcelain perfection of the noble women lounging in the capital. Instead, the scars began to luminesce from within. A soft, brilliant silver light bled into the damaged tissue, tracing the chaotic map of her countless battle wounds with an ethereal, glowing brilliance. The silver light pulsed in exact rhythm with her racing heartbeat, casting a stark, haunting illumination across the dark timber walls of the cabin and illuminating the absolute reverence on the healer's face. Kalen snatched his hand back, his breath hitching audibly in his chest. The stoic, unshakable military medic stared at the glowing marks with wide, primal shock. "By the goddess," he breathed, his low voice dropping into a shaky, terrified whisper. Valeria's inner beast, the wolf that had retreated into a tight, dark ball of agonizing trauma when the fated bond was severed at the altar, suddenly snapped its eyes open. It did not whine for the lost king. It did not crave the golden warmth of the Frost Keep or the security of the pack hierarchy. The beast rose to its full, terrifying height within her subconscious mind, its fur gleaming with the exact same blinding silver light that now radiated from her skin. The heavy, suffocating void left by the rejection was instantly flooded with the cold, absolute kinetic power of an ancient lineage. She was not merely a battle-tested warrior born to bleed for ungrateful royals. The deep, latent magic coursing through her veins was the undeniable biological signature of the first Guardians. The mythical white wolves of the high mountain peaks, a sovereign bloodline the aristocratic court believed had been completely extinct for centuries. The scars across her face and shoulder were not a grotesque disease or a badge of low birth. They were the physical conduits for her dormant power, finally forcibly awakened by the profound biological trauma of the broken bond and the catalyst of the pure herbal extract. Valeria looked down at her own glowing shoulder, watching the silver fire pulse beneath her skin. The silver light was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, lethal, absolute, unbending. She flexed her calloused fingers, feeling an immense, terrifying physical strength surging through her muscle fibers, completely erasing the lingering weakness of her fever. The agonizing pull of the severed mate bond was completely overwhelmed by the roaring, instinctual demand of her own sovereign magic. She did not weep for the man who had discarded her before his people. She simply watched the glowing, spidery patterns of light map their way across her skin, accepting the brutal, magnificent truth of her own existence. She had stepped aside once, believing herself too grotesque for a crown. She would never step aside again. While the scarred outcast awakened to an ancient, terrifying power in the frozen silence of the borderlands, the polished, pristine capital of Valdron was plunging into absolute slaughter. The transition from arrogant security to visceral terror took less than an hour. The wards were dead. The sudden beast invasion did not come with a formal declaration of war. It came as a massive grinding wave of dark fur, yellow eyes, and rotting fangs spilling out from the dense pine forests surrounding the Frostkeep. The rogue pack was unprecedented in its sheer, coordinated size and absolute brutality. They were massive, feral creatures, driven by a primal, starving madness, their bodies twisted by dark winter magic and endless starvation in the outer wastes. Normally, the capital keep was an impenetrable mountain fortress. The territorial wards, anchored by the sacred blood magic of the royal catacombs, should have projected a massive, invisible dome of kinetic force that would vaporize any unauthorized threat the second it touched the tree line, but the protective barrier was completely absent. When Cynthia Sterling had sneered at the ancient dirt and refused to complete the binding ceremony with the earth and blood, the magical perimeter had withered into nothingness. The sprawling stone city stood completely exposed to the claws of the wilderness. The first massive rogue wolf slammed violently into the heavy outer iron gates of the lower city. The reinforced metal groaned loudly under the sheer kinetic impact. Then came 100 more, their claws scraping against stone. The deafening, guttural howling shattered the tense, fragile quiet of the evening, echoing horribly off the soaring pillars of dark, ice-veined stone in the grand hall of the palace. Inside the keep, the aristocratic elite devolved into a pathetic, scrambling mass of pure panic. The same silk-clad nobles who had sneered at Valeria's battle-worn armor, who had politely covered their faces with velvet fans to block the scent of her blood and iron, were now shrieking in undisguised terror. They trampled over each other in their heavy brocade gowns and fur cloaks, desperately trying to flee away from the tall glass windows and toward the deeper, fortified interior chambers of the palace. The suffocating scent of expensive, poisoned honey and overripe lilies was entirely obliterated by the sharp, metallic tang of genuine, sudden fear and spilling blood. Cynthia Sterling stood near the elevated high dais, her porcelain skin completely devoid of color. The pristine noblewoman was shaking so violently that the moonstone coronet threatened to slip from her elaborately styled hair and shatter on the polished obsidian floor. The horrific, guttural screams of the outer city guards, being ripped apart by feral jaws, reached her delicate ears through the open corridors. This was not the elegant, sanitized version of sovereign rule she had been promised when she schemed for the king's favor. There were no diplomatic banquets, no polite applause from adoring subjects. There was only the terrifying reality of the dirt and the blood breaking down her door. Elder Orlan rushed toward her across the dais, his thick ceremonial robes billowing around his ankles as he moved with desperate speed. "My queen," the high priest barked, his raspy voice cutting through the chaotic din of the panicked court. "You must rally the inner guard. Your presence is required at the balcony to project stability to the soldiers. The pack must feel the Luna's resolve in the bond." Cynthia stared at the old priest as if he had entirely lost his mind. Her wide, frantic eyes darted toward the massive oak doors of the grand hall, which were already rattling under the distant, thudding impacts of the invading beasts breaking through the courtyard. The immediate reality of true physical danger completely shattered her fragile, manipulative facade. "I am not going out there!" Cynthia shrieked, her voice cracking into an ugly, high-pitched wail that echoed across the vaulted ceiling. "They will kill me. They will tear my face apart," without waiting for a royal escort or issuing a single command to protect the terrified citizens below. The newly crowned Luna grabbed the heavy, restrictive folds of her extravagant silver and pale grey silk gown. She turned her back on the screaming hall and ran. She shoved violently past a weeping servant girl, practically throwing the child to the cold stone floor to clear her path, and sprinted toward the narrow iron-reinforced stairwell that led down into the deep royal catacombs. The underground bunkers were the only place safe from the tearing fangs. She did not spare a single thought for the soldiers dying on the walls or the women crying in the courtyard. Cynthia simply abandoned her kingdom, fleeing into the darkness to preserve her perfect, unblemished skin, proving to the entire assembly exactly how worthless her crown truly was. Elder Orlan watched her disappear into the dark stairwell, his weathered face twisting in a bitter mixture of profound disgust and horrifying realization. The court had demanded superficial beauty over battle-tested strength, and now the beauty was hiding in a hole in the ground, while the realm burned to ash around them. At the very front of the inner courtyard, King Gideon stood entirely alone. The massive iron portcullis was slowly lowering, the rusted chains screaming in harsh protest against the freezing winter wind. Beyond the descending bars, the outer courtyard was already a chaotic, bloody slaughterhouse. The depleted royal guards, men who were used to fighting under the brilliant, unyielding tactical command of their supreme military defender, were breaking formation in sheer panic. They were terrified. They lacked the fierce, grounding anchor that Valeria had always provided during the darkest sieges. Without her roaring orders cutting through the din, without the brutal, inspiring sweep of her heavy iron blade leading the countercharge, the soldiers were simply disorganized meat for the starving rogue pack. Gideon drew his own weapon, a heavy, ornate ceremonial longsword that had not tasted real combat since the Southern Rebellions years ago. His broad chest heaved frantically beneath his silver chestplate. The towering frame of the Alpha King cast a long, lonely shadow across the blood-slicked cobblestones as the snow swirled around him. His storm-grey eyes locked onto the massive, feral beasts, attempting to squeeze their bodies through the closing gaps in the iron gate. He felt the immense, crushing weight of the failing kingdom settling squarely onto his shoulders. There was no protective magical dome to shield his people. There was no Luna standing bravely at his back to lend him spiritual and kinetic support. He was entirely, devastatingly alone in the storm. The king's dominant inner beast did not roar with the thrill of impending battle. It whimpered within his subconscious, a pathetic, agonizing sound of pure grief and physical torment. The severed fated mate bond pulsed in the center of his chest, like an open festering wound, sending a sharp, twisting agony through his nervous system that made his knees buckle slightly in the snow. His highly trained alpha senses involuntarily reached out across the distance, desperately searching the freezing wind for the grounding, instinctual rush of winter pine and sharp wood smoke. He needed her. He needed the scarred warrior who would have stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the freezing mud, laughing at the sheer impossible odds as she readied her blade. But Valeria was gone. He had thrown her away before the entire city, because he could not stomach the visual evidence of her unconditional loyalty. A massive rogue wolf, its dark fur matted with frozen blood and snow, launched itself directly at the iron bars, snapping its yellow, rotting jaws mere inches from Gideon's face. The king swung his heavy sword in a brutal two-handed arc, cleaving the beast's skull against the metal grate. Hot, dark blood sprayed across his pristine royal armor and splattered over his cheek. He did not raise a hand to wipe it away. "Stand your ground!" Gideon roared, his voice straining desperately to project sovereign authority over the deafening chaos of the siege. Defend the gate for Valdron, but his voice lacked the true, resonant kinetic power of a complete, bonded alpha. It was hollow, bleeding out into the freezing air without resonance. The soldiers flinched at the sound, retreating further back into the shadows of the inner keep rather than rallying to his side. The king stood his ground at the gate, his jaw locked in a rigid line of forced endurance as the wind howled around his crown. The storm-grey eyes that had once commanded the absolute loyalty of an entire continent were now filled with the sheer, terrifying understanding of his own monumental failure. The Alpha King was finally fighting a war he could not win, drowning in a terrifying ocean of his own regret, waiting for the monsters to tear his flawless empire to shreds. The burning scent of the capital gates, thick with ash and desperation, was a far cry from the cold, blood-stained snow of the Thornwick aftermath. In the quiet weeks that followed her departure, the ancient, protective wards of Valdron had steadily decayed without a true bonded Luna to anchor the soil with sacrificial devotion. The catastrophic collapse of his capital was merely the final echo of a doom that had already culminated 10 days ago. 200 miles to the south of the Forgotten Borderlands, an unprecedented rogue pack, hundreds of starving, red-eyed feral beasts driven mad by the dying winter, had flooded down from the northern ridges and the forgotten catacombs of the capital, swarming the border territories. At that exact hour, Cynthia Sterling had been residing in absolute, pampered luxury at the southern villa, just 3 miles from the outpost gates. King Gideon had sent his unblemished porcelain queen to the borderlands, accompanied by an elite escort of 24 royal guards, eager to display her delicate beauty to the provincial elders. But graceful smiles did not hold steel against monsters. When the warning horns screamed through the high valleys, and the first wave of blood-scented feral wolves breached the valley perimeter, Cynthia did not step forward to shield her people. She did not draw blood for the dirt. She dissolved into hysterical, self-preserving panic. She refused to let her knights engage the enemy. Instead, she commandeered the garrison's fastest horses, gathered her silk draperies and jewel-encrusted chests, and fled north toward the safety of the capital, explicitly screaming at her guards to abandon the local villagers and wounded border infantry to die in the freezing snow. Valeria Thorne had not run. She was no longer a commander of the royal army. Her family's ancestral weapon, the heavy iron ember blade, lay broken in 2 pieces on the polished stone floor of the Frostkeep throne room. Her chest was an open, bleeding spiritual wound where the fated mate bond had been forcibly severed by her sovereign's decree. Yet, as the terrified civilians fled toward the reinforced iron gates of the Thornwick Command outpost, Valeria did not hesitate. She picked up a standard, unbalanced infantry sword from a fallen soldier and walked alone out into the blizzard. She stood by herself at the narrow threshold of the outpost gates. For 6 agonizing hours, she fought the feral tide with bare steel and unrelenting, battle-hardened muscle. She bled into the frozen mud, taking slash after slash from feral claws, refusing to allow a single beast to cross into the crowded civilian shelters behind her. When the steel sword shattered in her calloused grip and 3 massive alphas pinned her to the frozen earth, tearing into her shoulder, the ancient, dormant magic within her bloodline finally answered the call of her sacrifice. The mythical White Wolf lineage, an ancient sovereign power that had slumbered within her family for generations, violently erupted beneath her skin. It did not manifest as a gentle warmth. It exploded through her veins like molten silver fire, consuming the pain of her broken mate bond, and transforming her jagged battle scars into conduits of pure, blinding kinetic luminescence. With a single devastating surge of glacial frost and white-hot energy, Valeria had unleashed a shockwave that vaporized the front ranks of the rogue horde and froze the remaining hundreds in spidery patterns of solid ice. She had saved the Thornwick borderland entirely on her own, collapsing into the red snow only when the last beast drew its final breath. Now, 10 days after that legendary siege, the snow across the decimated outpost gates remained deeply stained with frozen gore and black carcasses, a permanent monument to a discarded warrior's supremacy. Inside the drafty, reinforced command cabin at the edge of the outpost yard, the ambient warmth of the stone hearth flickered stubbornly against the creeping mountain frost. Valeria Thorne sat perfectly still on the edge of a rope-strung cot. Her upper body was wrapped in clean linen bandages, but she did not flinch, as the relentless Thornwick blizzard screamed through the jagged mountain passes outside. The blinding silver light that had erupted during her solitary stand at the gates had settled into a steady, dormant pulse, tracing the silver-threaded scars across her face and down her collarbone with a faint, permanent ethereal luminescence. Her steely gaze remained focused, calculating, and entirely devoid of fear. Her spine was held straight and unyielding. We are small things in a world of teeth, but she had proven her teeth were sharper. Beside her, Calen Drake paused, his rhythmic grinding at the wooden workbench. The veteran doctor slowly set down his heavy granite pestle. He wiped his corloosed hands on a rough linen cloth, his jaw tightening into a rigid line of defensive anticipation. For 10 days and 10 sleepless nights, Calen had stayed by her side, applying burning herbal tinctures and boiling sage to soothe the fever of her grievous physical wounds and the lingering cellular agony of her severed bond. He had watched her survive what would have killed a dozen prime alphas. He knew the immense, terrifying value of the woman sitting on that cot, and his keen, observant senses caught the heavy, erratic thud of exhausted hoofbeats and the desperate, dragging footsteps stumbling across the frozen courtyard long before the knock shattered the silence of the room. The heavy, reinforced timber of the cabin door shuddered violently against its iron hinges. It was not the chaotic force of the mountain wind. It was the deliberate, frantic strike of a heavy armored fist, accompanied by a low, guttural noise that was entirely too human to be a hunting rogue. It was a ragged, wheezing gasp for air, the sound of failing lungs desperately fighting for oxygen. Calen moved with the silent, efficient grace of a veteran field medic. He crossed the narrow floorboards, unlatching the heavy iron deadbolt and pulling the timber inward. The freezing winter wind immediately shrieked into the cabin, carrying with it a swirling cloud of blinding white snow and the overwhelming metallic stench of fresh, rotting blood rising from the frozen rogue carcasses littered across the outpost yard. King Gideon collapsed forward over the threshold. The Alpha King of Valdren did not look like a sovereign conqueror. His towering frame, usually held with absolute, rigid authority, was completely bent and broken. The pristine silver chestplate he had worn to defend the capital was deeply gouged by feral claws, the metal warped and smeared with dark, freezing gore. His heavy fur mantle was shredded into useless ribbons, but it was his face that betrayed the true, catastrophic depth of his downfall. The monarch's striking eyes were hollow, bloodshot, and wide with a terrifying, primal panic. He had abandoned his crumbling capital and ridden like a madman through the blizzards, tracking the only scent that could save his dying empire, only to arrive at the Thornwick gates and witness the impossible aftermath of her solitary war. He had ridden past hundreds of frozen monsters, realizing with sickening clarity that while his porcelain queen had fled in terror, his discarded mate had stood alone and defended his realm. He fell heavily onto his bruised knees on the rough wooden floorboards. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the deafening howl of the blizzard, but the suffocating tension in the room instantly multiplied. Gideon's dominant inner beast, which had been whimpering in absolute agonizing torment since the rejection ceremony, suddenly roared to life within his chest. The king took a sharp, desperate breath, inhaling the warm, earthy air of the cabin. Beneath the sharp scent of medicinal herbs and boiling sage, he finally found it. The grounding, instinctual aroma of winter pine and sharp wood smoke. It hit his completely exhausted nervous system like a physical blow. He looked up, his massive chest heaving violently, and saw her. Valeria remained seated on the edge of the cot. She did not rush forward. She did not gasp in horror at his catastrophic injuries or rush to offer him the physical comfort of her touch. She simply looked at him with the cold, clinical assessment of a stranger watching a wounded animal crawl into the light. The wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, it had become the moment her entire world shattered. Now, looking at the broken king on his knees, she felt only the icy calm of a woman who had already survived her own execution. "Valeria," King Gideon rasped. His voice broke completely, the sound tearing through his raw, bleeding throat. It was not the booming, absolute command of an alpha. It was the pathetic, shattered plea of a starving man, begging for a single drop of water. He reached into the battered remnants of his leather belt with a trembling, blood-stained hand. His thick fingers fumbled frantically before extracting a heavy crushed cylinder of parchment bound by a dark wax seal, a sovereign decree. It was the highest, most absolute legal command the Crown could issue, a document that historically compelled any Lycan to drop to their knees and obey without question. The edges of the paper were stained with the freezing mud of the borderlands. "The capital is falling," King Gideon choked out, dragging himself one agonizing inch forward on his knees. "The wards are dead. I rode through the southern valley. I saw the outpost gates. I saw what you did here 10 days ago. I saw the mountain of beasts you slaughtered alone while Cynthia ran." He swallowed hard, a tremor of absolute revulsion shaking his broad shoulders. She was at the southern villa when the horde struck. She didn't stay to fight for the people. She abandoned the villagers, commandeered the garrison horses, and fled back to Frostkeep in blind panic. "My guards are being slaughtered in the snow because the wards have completely evaporated." Valeria did not blink. Her heartbeat remained a slow, steady, rhythmic thrum, completely unaffected by the king's terror. She acutely noted the severe biological distress rolling off his massive frame. His pulse was a frantic, erratic staccato. His pupils were blown so wide they completely swallowed the grey irises, a clear sign of deep psychological shock and massive physical blood loss. The severed fated mate bond on the back of his neck clearly burned like a brand of pure acid, severely deteriorating his cellular health with every passing second he spent away from her. "The wards require a Luna who is willing to bleed for the dirt," Valeria stated softly. Her voice was steady, carrying the chilling, unforgiving weight of a frozen lake. "You chose a porcelain queen, Gideon. You cannot act surprised when porcelain shatters under pressure." King Gideon flinched, as if she had struck him across the face with the flat of a blade. His broad shoulders hitched. The sheer, devastating truth of her words pierced straight through his royal armor. He held the crushed parchment out toward her, his hand shaking so violently that the heavy seal rattled against the floorboards. "I was blind," he begged, the tears of absolute regret finally mixing with the frozen blood on his cheek. He lowered his head, pressing his bruised forehead to the rough timber floor in a total, humiliating surrender. "I was arrogant, Valeria. I threw away the only true thing I ever had because I was afraid of what the elite court would whisper about your scars. I am drowning. The pack is dying. I need you to return. I need the Supreme Military Defender to lead the countercharge and save our people. Please, I am formally recalling you to the Frostkeep." Silence settled heavily over the dense, warm air of the cabin. It was not a hesitant silence. It was the absolute, unyielding stillness of a mountain that refused to move for a passing storm. Valeria looked down at the man groveling at her bare feet. She remembered the blistering agony of the grand hall. She remembered the way the elite nobles had mocked her silver-threaded tissue. She remembered the exact, horrific snap of the sacred thread breaking when he had chosen a fragile aesthetic over her unconditional devotion. "I told you at the altar," Valeria said, her tone devoid of any gloating or malice, which somehow made the refusal infinitely more devastating. "The crown may have your pristine queen, but you will never hold my sword again." King Gideon snapped his head up. His expression twisted into a mask of pure, desperate disbelief. "You cannot turn your back on Valdron, the people." "I did not turn my back on Valdron," she interrupted, her iron-hued eyes flashing with a sudden, microscopic spark of silver light. "I stood in the blood at those gates 10 days ago to keep them safe while your chosen wife fled. I offered you my life, my loyalty, and my soul. You are the one who declared me too grotesque to sit beside you in the light. You cast the shield aside. You do not get to demand its protection just because the arrows have finally started to fall." The Alpha King stared at her, the horrific, final reality of her rejection, slowly sinking into his marrow. He had expected her to be angry. He had expected her to scream, to hit him, to demand a groveling apology, before eventually succumbing to the deep, instinctual pull of their shared history. He had not anticipated this terrifying, absolute indifference. She was not a wounded woman waiting to be reclaimed. She was a sovereign entity who had completely accepted his discard, and in doing so had evolved far beyond his reach. Cailan Drake remained utterly silent by the workbench, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The loyal caretaker watched the ruined monarch with a mixture of cold pity and fierce, unwavering protectiveness. He knew that the scarred warrior, sitting on the cot, possessed enough newly awakened magic from the White Wolf lineage to level the entire Frostkeep if she so chose, yet she simply sat there, refusing to offer the king a single drop of her power. Gideon's grief suddenly curdled. The deep, agonizing despair of his failure collided violently with the deeply ingrained, arrogant entitlement of the crown. The Alpha King had never been denied. He had never been told no by a subject, let alone by a woman he fundamentally believed still belonged to him by right of biological fate. The desperate panic in King Gideon's bloodshot eyes hardened into a dark, feral possessiveness. The pathetic, weeping monarch kneeling on the floorboards vanished, replaced instantly by a cornered, terrified predator attempting to exert control over a situation that had completely slipped through his fingers. He gripped the sovereign decree so tightly that the wax seal cracked into a dozen useless fragments, the dry red wax crumbling onto the timber. You are bound by the laws of the Lycan sovereignty. Gideon snarled, pushing himself up from the floor with a heavy metallic groan of his ruined armor. His towering frame rose to its full height in the small cabin, projecting a massive, suffocating aura of alpha dominance that caused the hanging glass vials to rattle against the timber walls. I am your king. I am ordering you to return to the capital and fulfill your duty. You will take back your command, Valeria, even if I have to physically drag you back to the gates myself. He lunged forward, his heavy, blood-stained leather glove reaching out to seize her bare bandaged arm. He never made contact. Cailan Drake moved with a sudden, explosive velocity that belied his calm demeanor. The unyielding medic stepped directly between the massive king and the narrow cot, his thick forearm coming up to violently block the aggressive reach. The jarring impact of bone against iron bracer echoed sharply in the small room. "She is no longer your subject, Gideon," Cailan growled, his own voice dropping into a dangerous, rumbling warning. He did not use the royal title. He looked the Alpha King directly in the eye without a shred of submission. "And you will not lay a single finger on her in my sanctuary." King Gideon's clouded gaze flared with pure, unadulterated fury. The sight of another male standing between him and his fated mate, even a severed one, sent his dominant beast into an absolute blind frenzy. "Step aside, medic," the king roared, his voice laced with the compelling kinetic vibration of the Alpha command. "Or I will execute you for treason where you stand." "Try it," the healer replied evenly, his stance rooting firmly into the wooden floorboards, entirely unswayed by the biological pressure. With a guttural shout, King Gideon lashed out. He shoved his massive shoulder forward, using the sheer, brutal weight of his heavy armor to slam into Cailan's chest. The medic was thrown backward by the sheer kinetic force. He crashed violently into the heavy wooden shelves. The timber splintered loudly. Dozens of glass vials and ceramic jars shattered across the floor, raining dried roots, sharp fragments, and liquid tinctures over the boards. King Gideon did not pause to watch the defender fall. He immediately pivoted back toward the cot, his large hand extending once more to grab Valeria, determined to force her compliance through sheer physical coercion. But Valeria Thorne was no longer sitting on the cot. The ambient heat vanished in a single terrifying gasp. A sudden, violent drop in temperature sucked the oxygen straight from the room, followed by a blinding flash of silver light that tore the shadows apart. She was standing directly in front of him. The thin, coarse linen tunic she wore seemed to ripple in the atmospheric shockwave. The ambient warmth of the roaring stone hearth was completely snuffed out in a fraction of a second, replaced by an elemental, glacial cold that froze the breath in King Gideon's lungs. The dormant silver pulse beneath Valeria's skin erupted. It did not merely glow. It ignited into a bludgeoning, physical manifestation of ancient, absolute power. The silver-threaded scars across her face and down her collarbone flared with the brilliance of a dying star. The latent magic of the mythical White Wolf lineage, awakened fully during her solitary stand at the border gates, surged violently into her bloodstream. Her storm-grey eyes had shifted entirely to luminous silver, locking onto the feral horde with the predatory unyielding focus of a deity passing final judgment. King Gideon froze, his hand suspended in midair. His inner beast did not snarl in challenge. It threw itself down onto its belly, whimpering in sheer biological terror at the monumental power radiating from the scarred woman. This was not the obedient, stoic military commander he had discarded at the altar. This was the raw, unbridled fury of the high mountains, a sovereign magic that predated his pathetic, fragile crown by 1,000 years. "You mistake my silence for weakness," Valeria whispered. Her voice was not loud, yet it resonated with a dual, overlapping echo that seemed to vibrate directly inside the king's marrow. She did not draw a blade. She did not throw a punch. Valeria simply raised her heavily corlused right hand and pressed her open palm flat against the center of his ruined silver chest plate. The physical impact was catastrophic. A massive concussive wave of pure kinetic magic blasted outward from her scars, channeling directly through her palm. The sheer force of the blow hit the Alpha King like a solid wall of moving iron. The heavy, dented metal of his breastplate buckled inward with a horrific crunch. King Gideon was lifted entirely off his feet. His massive, towering frame was violently launched backward through the air. He crashed through the open doorway of the cabin with the velocity of a fired cannonball, clearing the wooden porch entirely before slamming brutally into the frozen, snow-covered earth of the yard. He rolled 3 times through the deep drifts, his armor scraping harshly against the hidden rocks and the frozen carcasses of the rogue horde she had slain, before finally coming to a halt. He lay flat on his back, gasping frantically for air that refused to fill his lungs. The brutal strike had completely knocked the wind from him, bruising his ribs and shattering whatever fragile, arrogant illusion of control he still possessed. Inside the cabin, Cailan Drake pushed himself up from the wreckage of the shattered glass, wiping a thin trickle of blood from his jaw. He stared in absolute awe at the woman standing in the doorway. Valeria Thorne stood framed by the heavy timber frame, the relentless blizzard swirling violently around her, yet completely failing to touch her. The blinding light slowly began to recede from her skin, sinking back into the jagged lines of tissue, but the terrifying aura of absolute authority remained permanently etched into her posture. She looked down at the ruined, bleeding monarch groveling in the freezing dirt of the decimated outpost. King Gideon weakly lifted his head, spitting a mouthful of blood into the snow. He reached out a trembling hand toward the glowing figure in the doorway, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that he had not merely discarded a loyal soldier. He had banished the only true sovereign of the realm. The official decree lay forgotten and trampled in the snow between them, a pathetic, worthless scrap of paper against the weight of her ancient blood. "My kingdom is burning," King Gideon choked out, a final pathetic plea tearing from his throat. "Then let it burn," Valeria replied, her voice cutting through the howling wind with flawless, unwavering clarity. "You wanted a beautiful queen to sit in the light. Now you can watch her hide in the dark while your empire turns to ash." She did not wait for a response. She simply stepped back into the warm, earthy sanctuary of the cabin and pulled the heavy iron door shut. The solid slam of the timber echoed like a final, definitive death knell across the mountain, leaving the Alpha King entirely alone in the freezing, unforgiving dark. Frostkeep was burning. The impenetrable mountain fortress, built over centuries to humble those who stood within its massive walls, was now a fractured, smoking tomb of screaming elites. The grand courtyard, usually a flawless expanse of polished obsidian cobblestones, where noblewomen flaunted their untouched porcelain skin in the afternoon sun, had devolved into a horrific, blood-soaked slaughterhouse. The air was suffocatingly thick. It tasted distinctly of burning pine, pulverized ancient stone, and the hot, metallic stench of feral blood. Without the magical wards to regulate the ambient temperature, the brutal winter storm had poured directly into the capital's heart. The freezing wind shrieked through the shattered stained glass windows of the high towers, violently extinguishing the ceremonial braziers and freezing the blood of the dying royal guards directly to the very ground they desperately defended. The polite, superficial beauty of the sovereign court had been violently stripped away in a matter of agonizing hours, leaving only the raw, horrific reality of the dirt and the blood. The royal catacombs had proven to be a suffocating trap rather than a secure sanctuary. When the ancient stone ceilings began to crumble under the sheer kinetic weight of the siege above, Cynthia Sterling had scrambled blindly back to the surface, completely abandoning the terrified, weeping nobles she had locked in the dark. Now, in the center of the chaotic inner courtyard, a massive, ornate mahogany carriage stood hitched to 4 panicked, frothing horses. The royal crest of Valdron painted on the carriage doors was smeared with freezing mud and soot. The heavy vehicle was not being loaded with critical provisions for the starving soldiers, or thick bandages for the bleeding infantry holding the line. It was being frantically stuffed with heavy, velvet-lined chests of personal gold, diamond-encrusted tiaras, and bolts of rare southern silk. Cynthia stood near the carriage door, her once pristine complexion completely ruined, smeared with black ash and drying mud. The extravagant silver and pale grey silk gown that she had flaunted so proudly during her crowning was torn at the hem, soaked in freezing slush, dragging heavily on the stones. She was shaking violently, her delicate, unblemished hands gripping a leather riding crop with white-knuckled desperation. The cloying, overwhelming scent of poisoned honey and overripe lilies that usually rolled off her in perfectly curated waves was now entirely sour, rotting under the intense biological output of pure, unadulterated terror. The cold was sinking into her fragile bones, but her greed outweighed her shivering instinct to hide. "Faster!" Cynthia shrieked, lashing the riding crop brutally against the back of a weeping servant girl who was struggling to lift a heavy wooden box of pearls. The girl collapsed, spilling the shimmering white beads across the bloody slush, but Cynthia did not offer a shred of pity. "Leave the tapestries, you useless wretches. Just load the gold. The outer gates have fallen. They are coming, and I will not be dragged down by your incompetence. I am a symbol of this kingdom, and symbols do not bleed in the mud." Elder Orlan stumbled out from the deep shadows of the crumbling stone archway. The high priest of the Lycan sovereignty looked completely shattered, a frail ghost of his former authority. His thick ceremonial robes were soaked in dark, freezing blood from a dozen minor wounds. A deep, jagged gash ran across his weathered forehead, the blood crystallizing instantly in his bushy grey eyebrows. He carried a small, sobbing civilian child in his trembling arms, leaning heavily on a shattered wooden staff just to keep his exhausted body upright against the gale. His ancient bones ached with the catastrophic weight of the kingdom's failure. "My queen," Elder Orlan gasped, his raspy voice barely audible over the deafening, guttural roar of the encroaching beast horde echoing from the lower city. "The inner keep is breached. The citizens, the women and children are trapped in the lower armory. The smoke is suffocating them. We must use the carriage to transport the most critically wounded down the secret southern pass. We can save 50 innocent souls if we empty this gold." Cynthia spun around, her eyes wide with feral, selfish panic. She looked at the bleeding priest and the crying child with absolute, undisguised revulsion, as if they were vermin infecting her space. "Are you insane?" she screamed, her voice cracking into an ugly, high-pitched wail that grated harshly against the howling wind. "This is my wealth. This is my royal dowry. I am the Lunar of Valdron. I am not leaving my gold behind to drag a bunch of filthy, bleeding commoners through the snow. My life is worth 1,000 of theirs." Elder Orlan stared at the fragile, untouched noblewoman. The horrifying, undeniable realization of King Gideon's catastrophic choice settled deeply into the old priest's marrow like a terminal sickness. The Alpha King had chosen superficial beauty over the scarred warrior who had loved him unconditionally, and now the flawless beauty was fully prepared to watch the innocent burn to ash just to save her heavy jewelry. The kingdom was dying because it was ruled by cowards who loved the reflection of the crown more than the people it protected. Before Orlan could formulate a response, the heavy, iron-reinforced oak doors of the inner keep exploded inward. The deafening crack of shattering ancient timber echoed like a cannon shot across the enclosed courtyard. A massive, terrifying wave of dark fur, glowing yellow eyes, and rotting fangs spilled violently through the breach. The beast horde had officially breached the inner city. These were not mere rogue wolves. They were massive, twisted monstrosities of dark magic, their bodies warped by a starving, feral madness. The leading beast, a towering feral alpha with exposed bone along its spine, frostbitten lips, and eyes like burning coals, locked its predatory gaze squarely on the panicked horses and the screaming queen. The overwhelming stench of decay and raw slaughter washed over the courtyard in an unbearable, suffocating wave. Cynthia dropped her riding crop, her jaw unhinged in a silent, paralyzed scream of absolute horror. She scrambled backward, frantically trying to haul her delicate body into the carriage, entirely abandoning the weeping servants, the spilled gold, and the bleeding priest without a single second of hesitation. But her silver-heeled shoe caught harshly on the heavy torn edge of her ruined silk gown. She tripped, collapsing hard onto the freezing cobblestones, her perfect hand scraping raw against the ice. The feral alpha lunged, its massive jaws opening wide to snap Cynthia's fragile spine in two. The wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, it became the moment Valeria Thorne's entire world shattered. But Valeria had survived her public betrayal, and she had not returned for the crown. The ambient temperature in the courtyard abruptly plummeted. It was not a natural shift in the mountain weather. It was a localized, suffocating drop into absolute zero that sucked the oxygen straight from the lungs of every living creature in the square. The feral alpha froze in mid-air, its necrotic muscles seizing violently as a concussive wave of glacial frost hit its massive body, suspended inches away from Cynthia's screaming face. A blinding flash of silver light tore through the heavy gothic shadows. Valeria Thorne stepped through the breached archway. She had crossed the vast, treacherous 200 miles from the Thornwick borderlands, with the terrifying kinetic velocity of the mythical White Wolf lineage. She wore no heavy iron armor. She carried no ceremonial shield. She was clad in a simple, heavy leather duster and rough mountain wool, her calloused hands completely empty. But she was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. Lethal, absolute, unbending. The dormant silver pulse beneath her skin had erupted into a blinding, physical manifestation of ancient, untamed power. The silver-threaded scars across her face and down her collarbone flared with the sheer brilliance of a dying star, cutting through the blizzard. Her storm-grey eyes had shifted entirely to luminous silver, locking onto the feral horde with the predatory, unyielding focus of a deity passing final judgment. The sheer atmospheric pressure of her presence crushed the feral madness of the horde into whimpering submission. Beside her stood Caelan Drake, the steadfast pack healer, his rugged face set into a mask of clinical, unyielding resolve. He held a pair of heavy, iron-weighted fighting knives, his movements perfectly in sync with the scarred warrior he had sworn to protect. They had not come to save a cowardly king. They had come to save the innocent. "Get the people out, Orlan," Valeria commanded. Her voice was not a scream. It was a low, steady command that carried the chilling, unforgiving weight of a mountain blizzard, resonating with a dual, overlapping echo that forced the surviving royal guards to drop to their knees in instinctual reverence. Cynthia cowered on the icy ground, weeping pathetically as she stared up at the woman she had mocked and ousted. The porcelain queen was entirely helpless, covered in mud, soot, and terror, while the scarred, discarded outcast stood tall as the absolute, undisputed savior of the realm. The stark contrast between them was a physical blow to the watching court, completely shattering the illusion of Cynthia's divine right to rule. Every noble who had sneered at Valeria's battle scars now realized that those very scars were the only thing standing between them and a violent, agonizing death. Valeria did not spare the false Luna a single glance. She turned her glowing, silver gaze toward the charging beast horde. Her inner wolf did not whimper. It did not seek the approval of the court. It rose to its full, terrifying height within her mind, roaring with the ancient, kinetic power of the high mountains. We are small things in a world of teeth, but today, Valeria Thorne possessed the sharpest teeth of them all. She raised her heavily calloused hands. The latent magic within her bloodstream responded violently. Spidery patterns of ice exploded outward from her heavy leather boots, racing across the blood-slicked cobblestones at a terrifying, unnatural speed. The freezing frost caught the front ranks of the rogue pack, locking their massive paws to the ground and turning their rotting blood to solid ice in a fraction of a second. The feral beasts shrieked in confusion, their primal brains entirely unable to comprehend the sheer devastating elemental force of the White Wolf magic. Kaelin moved with explosive velocity, stepping seamlessly into the gaps of her magical defense to execute the beasts that managed to break through the frost. The veteran field doctor threw a concentrated glass vial of the silver salve directly into the face of a lunging rogue. The volatile herbal ointment, meant to soothe skin-tearing agony, ignited upon contact with the beast's dark magic, burning its skull down to the bone in a blinding flash of white fire. Valeria and Kaelin fought not as sovereign and subservient soldier, but as perfect, equal partners in a deadly, rehearsed dance of survival. Not used, not owned, chosen. The battle spilled rapidly from the ruined courtyard directly into the grand hall of the Frostkeep. The massive oak doors had been completely torn from their iron hinges, reduced to jagged splinters, scattered across the blood-slicked stones. The soaring pillars of dark, ice-veined stone were now deeply scarred by feral claw marks and scorched by the violent bursts of Kaelin's alchemical fire. Valeria walked into the gothic shadows of the throne room, her silver-threaded tissue illuminating the darkness with a steady, ethereal pulse. The air in the throne room was stale, thick with the memory of the rejection ceremony that had shattered her, but she felt no sting of grief. The hollow space in her chest, once occupied by a desperate need for the king's validation, was now entirely filled with the freezing, kinetic power of her ancestors. The heavy silence of the grand hall was broken only by the guttural panting of the horde's monstrous commander. Waiting in the center of the polished obsidian floor was the beast leader. It was a colossal, twisted nightmare of dark fur and necrotic muscle, standing twice the height of a normal lichen. Black venom dripped constantly from its jagged fangs, sizzling violently and melting the stone as it hit the marble steps of the royal dais. It had slaughtered dozens of elite guards, absorbing their life force to fuel its starving madness. It was the physical manifestation of the kingdom's unchecked rot. It let out a guttural, ground-shaking roar and charged. Valeria did not step back. She did not reach for a blade. The fated mate bond that had once tied her to this room was nothing but a dead, hollow memory. She was entirely free. She planted her heavy leather boots on the freezing stone. As the colossal monstrosity lunged, its massive jaws snapping down toward her throat, Valeria lunged forward to meet it. She thrust both of her glowing, calloused hands directly against the beast's massive chest. The physical impact was catastrophic. A massive, concussive wave of pure kinetic magic blasted outward from her scars, channeling directly through her palms. The sheer force of the blow hit the beast leader like a solid wall of moving iron. The glacial cold instantly infiltrated its necrotic veins, freezing its dark heart mid-beat. The air cracked with the sound of snapping ice. With a swift, brutal exhalation of breath, Valeria twisted her wrists. The monster's frozen core shattered completely. The colossal beast exploded into a million jagged shards of black ice and frozen blood, raining harmlessly across the obsidian tiles like a shower of dark diamonds. The remaining feral beasts, feeling the instantaneous, terrifying death of their alpha, broke their assault. Driven by sheer biological terror, the horde turned and fled into the blinding blizzard, abandoning the siege entirely. Silence descended upon the grand hall. It was not the oppressive, arrogant silence of the sovereign court that had condemned her. It was the heavy, exhausted stillness of hard-won survival. Valeria stood at the base of the royal dais. Her breathing was slow and perfectly regulated. The blinding silver light slowly began to recede from her skin, sinking back into the jagged lines of tissue. But the terrifying aura of absolute authority remained permanently etched into her posture. She looked down at the stone floor. Resting there, exactly where she had thrown them 2 months ago, were the rusted, frozen halves of the Ember Blade. The ultimate symbol of her family's unyielding, exploited loyalty to a coward. The heavy, erratic thud of dragging footsteps echoed from the ruined entrance. King Gideon collapsed into the grand hall. The Alpha King had frantically forced his exhausted body to return to the capital, running on foot through the blizzards after her kinetic blast at the cabin had shattered his pride. He was a complete ruin of a monarch. His face was ravaged by frostbite, the once handsome features twisted in profound agony. His pristine silver chestplate was buckled and destroyed. His usually commanding eyes were hollow, bloodshot, and wide with primal panic. He fell heavily to his bruised knees on the polished obsidian, gasping frantically for air, his lungs wheezing in the freezing draught. He looked up and saw Valeria standing victorious among the shattered ice, the undisputed savior of the capital he had failed to protect. He saw the citizens emerging from the armory, looking at her with absolute reverence. The catastrophic, kingdom-ending weight of his arrogance finally crushed his spine. The sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding. It was completely gone. Vanished like smoke through a crack in the world. He felt the terrifying, absolute void in his chest where her warmth used to reside, knowing it would never return. The pain of the severed bond was a physical rot eating away at his sternum. Valeria! Gideon rasped, the sound tearing through his bleeding throat. It was the pathetic, shattered plea of a starving man, begging for a single drop of water. He dragged himself forward on his hands and knees, crawling over the shards of black ice and the frozen blood of his guards. The sharp edges sliced into his palms, but the physical pain was completely eclipsed by the suffocating psychological torment crushing his mind. He reached the base of the dais, his trembling hands desperately reaching out toward the hem of her heavy leather duster, yet not daring to touch it. He knew that if he touched her, the sheer contrast between her absolute purity and his unforgivable betrayal would shatter whatever was left of his sanity. He looked at the shattered steel of the Ember Blade on the floor, the physical proof of his ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. I was wrong, the Alpha King wept, tears of absolute regret spilling freely down his bruised cheeks, freezing before they hit the stone. He lowered his head, pressing his forehead to the freezing tiles in a total, humiliating public surrender. I traded the sun for a candle. I let the whispers of a cowardly court poison my mind. I have not slept in 60 days. My chest is entirely hollow. You are the true Luna. You are the guardian of the North. I beg you, take the crown, take my life. Punish me however you see fit, but please do not leave me in this dark. Valeria looked down at the weeping monarch. The inner wolf inside her did not whimper. It felt absolutely nothing for him. He was offering her the absolute devotion she had once bled for, the crown she had earned, the grovelling apology of an all-powerful king kneeling in the dirt. It was entirely too late. You do not understand, Gideon, Valeria stated softly. Her voice was steady, carrying the chilling, unforgiving weight of a frozen lake. I did not come back to claim your throne. I came back because innocent people were dying for your mistakes. I have no use for a crown built on lies. She reached down, but not to touch his trembling shoulder. She picked up the 2 rusted halves of the ember blade. The cold iron felt heavy and dead in her calloused hands, stripping away the last lingering ghosts of her past loyalty. She stepped past the grovelling king, walked up the marble steps of the dais, and placed the shattered pieces gently on the crushed velvet cushion of the pedestal, exactly where the moonstone coronet had sat on the day of her public betrayal. "You wanted a beautiful queen to sit in the light," Valeria said, her piercing stare meeting his tear-filled gaze with flawless, unwavering clarity. "You chose porcelain. I chose the dirt." She turned her back on the kneeling king. She did not offer a formal bow. She simply walked away from the throne, her spine straight, her shoulders relaxed, leaving the heavy burden of the sovereign court behind her forever. Cailan Drake stood waiting for her in the ruined archway, his rugged face softening into a rare, genuine smile as she approached. He offered his hand, not as a sovereign demanding submission, but as a partner offering absolute warmth and equality. She took it. The simple, calloused touch anchored her, pulling her away from the suffocating politics of a court that despised her and toward the quiet, peaceful life she had finally earned. They walked out into the clearing winter storm together, their intertwined hands a silent testament to survival, leaving the Alpha King entirely alone in the grand hall to rule over a ruined kingdom and the rusted fragments of a shattered sword. The quiet cabin in the high country still stands, its chimney smoke rising against the grey sky. They say a king still weeps on a ruined throne, and a scarred warrior still heals the fractured in the deep pines. If you believe that true power lies in the dirt and the blood rather than a polished crown, please like and subscribe to join our quiet sanctuary.